I've got 11 o'clock on my phone here, so I think we're going to get going. We've got a jam-packed hour lined up here for you. Hello and welcome back to everyone who's joining us for the first time, or perhaps in addition to all the ones that we did last year. I'm Ashley Honsberger. I'm the Executive Director for Poultry Industry Council. I'll be hosting today, and we do have, as I mentioned, a really awesome kickoff webinar lined up here for you. So just to give you an overview, we have some new resources. We have an awesome logo, which is a great start for our project, but I'm just going to share a little bit of information about that. We've also got Dr. Ellen Denstead, who's going to give us a little overview from the CFIA perspective. So they were a great partner of ours last year in sharing and disseminating information. So we're going to keep that going today. Dr. Brian Stevens is going to give us a little bit of a wild bird update. So some stuff happening there, which I think you'll find very interesting. And last but not least, we have Al Dam bringing up the rear. Kind of a negative title, but some good information, some good refreshers on all of the resources that we have available to help you and your flock do the right things over the next little while. So before I get going, we have to mention that this project is supported through the Canadian Ag Partnership, or the Sustainable Canadian Ag Partnership. So PIC is working with OMAFRA once again for the next 2 years to deliver non-supply managed and small flock information and resources, particularly related to AI, but also just to kind of get some good animal husbandry practices shared as well. So Poultry Industry Council, if you're not familiar, typically we'd be on the beach at this time of year, but we find ourselves here doing our education gig continuously throughout the summer. So we're an education and extension focused organization, and our goal is to share leading practices in the Ontario poultry sector. So typically we do focus on the commercial side of things, and that's where our founding partners are from and all that kind of stuff. But because of the way avian influenza went last year, we had the opportunity to support the small flock and non-supply managed folks with information and outreach. So we're going to continue on that vein. Just also wanted to say thank you for taking an hour out of your day to listen to the information. Education is our gig, and it's just really exciting to be able to share that on an ongoing basis to those who are interested in enhancing poultry knowledge. So if you do have any questions today, feel free to pop those into the chat function. We're going to be tracking them and getting to all the ones that we can. So a very quick recap, what happened last year. So obviously avian influenza hit Ontario and Canada quite hard, as well as worldwide. So PIC in partnership with OMAFRA stepped up to the plate, and we did an emergency response style series of webinars throughout the spring. So you can see we had quite a strong response to that. Got a little quiet over the summer, and then we picked up again in the fall. The emergency alerts were kind of tamping down, even though we still did have that ongoing threat of avian influenza getting into small flocks and commercial flocks as well. So just a review that we did continue to cover, and then we were able to expand into other topics like cleaning and disinfecting and some other skills that are helpful for maintaining that strong biosecurity in your flock or in your operation. But moving on to now, we have some new resources. So we're maintaining momentum, but we're less in an emergency stage, and we're doing more proactive outreach on the education side of things, which is a great place to be. So starting now, we do have a new website, smallflockontario.ca. So it just went live literally an hour ago. So we're really excited to start piling all good information into this website, including videos and things like that. So I just snippeted a little screen shot, which isn't right now. We're doing some field level outreach as well throughout the fall and into next year. So we have some retired folks from the industry that are going to help us reach out to different retailers and point of sale places for input supply, as well as chicks, to share information on biosecurity and what to do if you happen to run into the situation where you have avian influenza in your flock. So some of that supported through booklets, through checklists, through biosecurity kits. So here's just a little sneak preview of what we've got coming up. We're also going to be doing more webinars. So today is just kind of an overview, a refresher for everybody, where to find what you're looking for. We're going to be talking current status of AI, other diseases of concern, some of those biosecurity practices, status in wild birds, all of this stuff. Some of the things that folks were interested in learning about were a little more on the animal husbandry side, so that's not in scope for today, but we are taking that into consideration for future webinar sessions. But I'll also say that OMAFRA has a huge roster of information on their website related to most of these topics. So I'd invite you to check that website out first, just to see what basic information, and then if we can help you with any further learning, please feel free to reach out. So as I mentioned, smallflockontario.ca went live, and so some of the topics that folks indicated they were interested in were actually covered in some of the stuff we did last year. So Charlotte spent a lot of time pulling out and snippeting those good chunks into shorter videos, sort of based on topics. So this is a section of the website that is very helpful and will continue to grow as time moves forward. So our first speaker, as I mentioned, is Dr. Ellen Denstead, and she is from the CFIA. So I'll just invite Ellen to turn on your camera and then share your screen.
All right, thank you, Ashley, and congratulations on your website and those visual aids. They look awesome. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today. My name is Dr. Ellen Denstead, and I'm a veterinarian that has been deployed with the avian influenza response with CFIA since the beginning of the outbreak here in Ontario, since March of last year. Today, my presentation will focus on the impact avian influenza, or AI for short, can have on your small flock if they unfortunately become infected with the disease and what it means for you. So just going back to some of the basics here, avian influenza is a broad term for a group of viruses that primarily infect birds, of which there are many different kinds, strains, and types. Avian influenza viruses can behave in different ways. Some cause low levels of disease and may not even cause death, while others are highly pathogenic, meaning that they rip through a flock, causing a high degree of sickness and death and devastation. For specific virus types that we know historically like to behave badly, as we say, we have classified them as being reportable in Canada, which I will explain a little bit later. Risk factors for contracting an avian influenza virus in a small flock, including the highly pathogenic types, include a lack of biosecurity, which is a topic that's going to be covered in depth later today, which can include such things as not properly changing of footwear, hand hygiene, not having a pest control program in place. Direct contact with wild birds is a big one. They love to harbor the virus, and some species can be infected and shed the disease with no obvious signs at all. Proximity to wet areas where these wild birds like to congregate, eat, and defecate and shed the virus is another important risk factor, as well as buying infected birds with an unknown health status and bringing those birds to your flock. The first thing to do if you suspect your flock might be infected is to call your veterinarian if you have one, or the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. If you don't have a veterinarian or are unable to reach one, the CFIA will conduct a questionnaire prior to moving forward to determine the level of risk at your farm. One thing to note is that the CFIA, and for the most part, your private vet, typically do not deal with sick or dead wild birds, and you would need to call the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, or CWHC, for concerns of that nature. So going back to reporting the disease, many people may not know this, but both veterinarians and the public are legally bound and required to report to the CFIA if they suspect their flock is infected with a reportable disease, i.e. in this case being avian influenza. You're not going to get in trouble for being worried and reporting out of caution. We want to know if this disease is occurring somewhere in Canada. We want to investigate if the risk is high enough, and it's part of our job to do so. So just keeping that important piece in mind, that it is actually part of our legal legislation. If the risk determination is made that we need to come out and test your birds, you need to take measures to protect yourself and others, as this is a disease, although rarely, particularly with this strain, that humans can become infected with if they are exposed. So you want to wash your hands, call your doctor if you develop flu-like symptoms, keep your birds indoors and away from household pets. You want to keep immunocompromised people in your family away from your birds, and don't move anything on or off your premises until we've completed our investigation. So if the test is positive for highly pathogenic avian influenza, a number of things will happen under the direction of CFIA that I won't go into detail on here, but just briefly. Those include quarantine measures which will be put into place. We'll ask you some more questions about what sorts of movements have happened on or off your premises. We'll determine what type of infected premises you have, which I'll go into a bit later. The flock will be destroyed and disposed of. Cleaning and disinfection will ensue. And throughout this process, we work with you to gather as much information as possible to pay you for things and animals that are ordered, destroyed, or disposed of. So that's something that's also going on in the background. In terms of the quarantine, I just wanted to highlight that we quarantine the birds and the things in contact with them and their products, such as their eggs, manure, potentially their feed, but we do not, nor do we have the authority to quarantine people. So you will be able to live your life and leave your house, if your flock is infected, but it is done in a way to mitigate further disease spread by spraying tires and dedicating footwear and things of that nature if needed. So I said before that we determine what type of infected premises you are, and this impacts a number of things. Typically, most small flocks will fall under the category of being what we consider non-commercial or non-poultry, as opposed to a commercial operation. Commercial operations can include a multitude of places or establishment setups. They can include chickens and turkeys raised under Canada's quota system for producing or selling their products or breeding for these purposes. Or it can include birds raised outside the quota system, which number more than 300 or more, and there is commercial activities happening, such as there is buying of selling of birds or products. It is important to remember that even if someone considers their flock as being small, if they number in 300 or more, and there is those types of commercial activities happening, they would be considered a commercial flock. This has happened for a number of places in Ontario that they consider themselves as small flocks, but by CFIA's definition, they fall under this category. Non-commercial poultry flocks are those with less than 300 birds and participate in some sort of commercialized activity, which could include selling of eggs to your neighbor, for example. Non-poultry have less than 300 birds typically, but their activities are restricted to the household only. And even though we say they are non-poultry, it still does include birds that we would traditionally think of as poultry, which can complicate things. But they are small in number, being the important fact, and their use doesn't extend beyond household use. The bottom line is the classification of infected premises is made in such a way based on the level of risk of spread of the disease to other places. So if there's a high number of birds at the site, they're shedding the virus, and there was movement of lots of birds or products occurring, that is a higher likelihood of potentially spreading the disease, as opposed to a small number of birds where nothing has really moved on or off the property. So your classification as an infected premises could impact your neighbors. And I say could for one particular reason. So non-commercial infected flocks will have to have an approximately 10-kilometer zone established around it. And anyone moving poultry or poultry products within that zone will require a permit to do so. And there is a limited amount of surveillance or testing that goes on at your neighbor's premises. The zone being released depends on how quickly your premises gets through the cleaning and disinfection process. And it's important to note that your address is never posted publicly, nor is that information released to the public. All that would be posted is that there is a positive premises in your township or county, and that a zone was drawn in a random configuration to reduce the likelihood that someone could determine where the positive detection was. So non-poultry, on the other hand, will not have a zone established. So none of your neighbors will need permits or testing, which is great. The activities are restricted to your premises only. So regardless of whether you are considered commercial, non-commercial, or non-poultry, all of the same milestones must be met to release the zone if one was made, and to release the restrictions and quarantine on your premises. All have to go through the depopulation, disposal, and C&D milestones, but how each place and how quickly they move through those milestones obviously is premises dependent. So that's where I'm going to end things for today. I just have this visual aid with some of the topics that are covered in a number of these presentations, as well as on PIC's website, just for your interest. And I believe questions are going to be held to the end, so we can chat then. And thanks for joining.
Thanks very much, Ellen. That was an excellent overview. And of course, your website there does have a ton of great information that breaks things down and talks about permitting. So it's a huge wealth of information. Also, your comment about veterinarians, I know we ran into this last year. There is a shortage of poultry veterinarians, specifically for small flocks or backyard flocks. So it's a tricky pitch point, but there are resources that Al's going to share as far as how can we find a vet. But great to know that we can come straight to CFIA as well if we have a concern. Great. So now we're going to move along and invite Brian Stevens to join us here.
All right. Well, thanks for having me on. Thanks, Ashley. So I'm the wildlife pathologist for the Ontario region of the Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative, and I just want to give an update on what we've been seeing in wild populations when it comes to this virus. So just to give you a comparison of last year versus this year, and this is all of last year, so all of 2022 is this map on your left-hand side, and then so far for 2023 is here. And what I want to show you, and I'll come back to this later, is just kind of the distribution of what we've seen in wild birds so far this year. So you can see in 2022, we were spread pretty much across all of Southern Ontario, through Eastern Ontario, going a little bit further north into Sudbury, and then up into Northwestern Ontario, where it hit more pelicans than anything else up there. And then so far this year, it's kind of clustered mostly around the GTA, a little bit out into Southwestern Ontario, Lake Erie, and up a little bit into Georgian Bay, but not much going on Eastern Ontario this year. And this cluster in the GTA was mainly because of a few mass mortality events that we had in Canada geese. So you may have come across this in the news because there were a lot of news stories, because we had in some regions, specifically in Caledon and Vaughan, hundreds of geese that were dying in some of these areas. So we did have quite a number of mass mortality events, specifically in Canada geese. As I mentioned, Caledon and Vaughan was a big area, but other regions like Brampton, Newmarket, Mississauga, Oakville, a few others had anywhere from a handful up to a few dozen Canada geese that were dying in different areas. And this kind of started in early March and went throughout the entire month of March into April. And that seemed to be mainly what we were seeing, and not so much elsewhere in the province. One thing that we had talked about last year was, in addition to our waterfowl and other water birds, we started to pick up this virus in different scavenger species. Two in particular last year were hit pretty hard: turkey vultures and bald eagles. And I wanted to kind of highlight what we'd seen with them and what we've seen in crows as well this year, because there's been a bit of a change from last year into 2023. So just looking at turkey vultures, we had a total of 23 test positive last year. 17 of those were in the spring. And so far in 2023, we've had 15 that have tested positive. So very similar numbers for turkey vultures between 2022 and 2023 at this point. Bald eagles, we did see a sharp decline in the number of cases. So we had 9 in the spring last year. So far, we've only had 1 in 2023 test positive. And then crows went the other way, where we had 3 total last year, 1 in the spring, the other 2 were in the fall. And then already in 2023, we've had 25 American crows test positive for this virus. So we've definitely seen a change where bald eagles seem to be less affected this year compared to last year, and crows seem to be more affected this year compared to last year. And I wonder if that has to do with the geography of where we're seeing this. So as I mentioned, the GTA was what we've seen focus this year, whereas last year was kind of spread across the province. For turkey vultures, we'll see them both in rural and urban areas. So not surprising that they are similarly affected this year versus last year, whereas bald eagles, we're not going to see them as commonly in the urban centers, whereas American crows, they are going to be very concentrated in those urban centers. So I wonder if that's why we've got that sharp increase in crows and that decrease in bald eagles. But again, that's just speculation on my part. I spoke a bit about wild mammals last year. We first detected in red foxes here in Ontario, and we've seen a number of red foxes over the year. Continuing on, we've started to see a few more skunks and raccoons this year. And again, that may be because of urban centers being more affected this year compared to last. But just so you know, there are other species that are affected. So mink, we had a fisher cat this year, we had a river otter last year. Pretty much any mammal that could be potentially scavenging on wild birds could potentially become infected with this virus. And by far, we've seen it most commonly in the red foxes. Talking to colleagues across the country, raccoons and striped skunks are coming up for them quite a bit. And again, it's probably just that they are in contact with these birds more than others. And in these urban centers, these geese are going to come in contact with skunks and raccoons. One change that we saw in mammals was we did start to see a couple of domestic animal cases come up. Not so much on the wildlife side for this, but I just want to mention it because it does come into play. So we had one dog test positive here in Ontario, and it was seen chewing on a Canada goose, a dead Canada goose, a few days prior to becoming sick and dying. So I'm sure you saw this in the news a few months ago. And we were able to send samples from the goose, and the lab sent samples from the dog, and it was confirmed that the virus that was infecting the dog was the same one from the goose that it was chewing on. It's unclear if that dog actually died of avian influenza. Last I spoke to the pathologist, it was unfortunately unclear. There were other things going on with that dog that may have actually led to its death. The other one I want to mention is cats. So there have been different areas across Europe and in the US that have detected it in domestic cats, and we was partnered with the Public Health Agency to test cats. We usually get them in for rabies testing. So these are feral cats not owned by anybody. And we've started testing them for avian influenza, and 4 out of the 5 we've tested so far have come back positive. And presumably they're similar to wild mammals where they're scavenging on dead birds. So something just to be aware of for your own pets, not to let your dogs out off leash, or if they are, monitor them at all times. Same with cats. If they're going to be going outside, then they should be monitored not only for the safety of the wildlife, but also for your cat safety and for your own safety. Just to give you an idea as to what's been going on in different areas of Canada. So Quebec's tested a few other wild mammal species. So they've had a positive black bear there, a positive white-sided dolphin, as well as a mortality event in harbor seals that was associated with this virus. And then I know pigeons are always asked about. We haven't had any wild pigeons in Ontario come up positive. We did have those domestic pigeons last year. But talking to colleagues of mine out in Saskatchewan, they have now had 2 wild pigeons that have tested positive on preliminary testing. This is still needed to be confirmed that it is the H5N1 virus, but the preliminary results are suggestive of that. So as we suspected, pigeons can be infected by this virus. It's likely less common than the waterfowl that are out there, but we do know that they can get this virus and can spread it around. And then globally, there's been a few things going on. So in Spain, there was an outbreak in a mink farm. And obviously, when you have a number of animals in a small area like that, there's always concern for any sort of spread from animal to animal or the people working on the farm. Thankfully, there was no evidence that it spread to people, and there was no evidence to suggest that it was spreading from mammal to mammal. It all seemed to be contaminated feed that was the issue. And then down in South America, specifically in Chile and Peru, they've had mass mortality events in their sea lions down there, with thousands of sea lions that have died of this virus. And this is in regions where there are tens of thousands of seabirds. And again, there's a lot of concern. Could there be spread between mammals? Because once that jump goes from mammal to mammal spread, then it could potentially jump into people and allow for spread from people to people. But at this point, there hasn't been any evidence of that, but it is something a lot of people are keeping a close eye on. So I kind of wanted to end with what we expect going forward with this. So comparing last year to this year, as I mentioned, similar numbers, but the spread across the province is quite a bit different. So this is a map of spring of 2022 versus spring of 2023. And you can see by all the red dots here that last year was spread pretty much across most of the province. Again, the urban centers are going to come up with more cases because more people are there to report them. But presumably it was across the entire province we were getting cases. And you can see Eastern Ontario out in Ottawa, you can see little clusters. Out in Western Lake Erie, little clusters there. And we weren't seeing those same clusters this year, scattered cases in those regions. And really it was focused on the GTA this year. And the reason for that is unclear. It could be that some of these wild birds have some immunity now to this virus because they have been exposed to it previously. So we're getting fewer cases in those big flyways as opposed to last year. And we've got more of the naive population in the GTA that was hit hard this spring. But that's something I think we're just going to have to see as this virus continues to go along. So the fall of last year, we had fewer cases coming in, not a surprise. We don't have the nesting animals at that time of year. So typically we're just going to get those migratory events. And we did have a mass mortality event last year that kind of bumped those numbers up a bit. So without taking into account those snow geese in the Eastern Ontario last year, we were probably at around 60 to 65 positives. So what can we expect this fall? I expect a drop in the number of cases again. We'll see how much of a drop there is, whether it is similar to last year in that 50 to 60 range, or whether it will be a little bit less than that. And then we really need to think of this as being an endemic virus where it's going to be here for the long term. We're in year 2 of this. I suspect we'll go into year 3 into 2024, but we'll be monitoring this over the next little while to see exactly what's been going on with these birds and whether or not we can get immunity in that population and start to see a decrease in the number of cases going forward. So I just want to kind of end to show you that you can definitely contact us if there are any reports of wild birds. We have a toll-free number, email address as well, and we have an online reporting tool. So you can definitely contact us many different ways if you do have concerns about dead wildlife on your property or that you find, and we'll try and help figure out what's going on with them. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end of this talk when it comes to wildlife.
Thanks very much, Brian. That was an amazing overview. I just had a quick question, like in terms of the EU, are they also seeing like the same ratio, I guess, of drops from last year to this year?
Truthfully, I haven't looked at it close enough to know. I don't know for sure if they've seen the drops that we've seen. I've just been looking at what we've seen across Canada. I can tell you that cases have decreased overall across different regions. It was a little bit odd for the national perspective because they were wondering why we had so many cases compared to everyone else, but we had that one population in the GTA that was hit hard. But at least in Canada, it seems like we're on a decrease across the board.
Positive news. Okay, thanks again. So now I'm going to invite Al Dam to come on. And again, if anyone has questions, feel free to pop those into the chat.
Welcome, everyone. I get to talk about the subject that everyone hates to hear about, which is biosecurity. I've been doing this job for 16, 17, 18 years now, and I've been saying the same shtick the whole time. And you'd think that I'd have to, at some point, be able to stop saying the message, but it is still important to talk about it. And yes, biosecurity fatigue is a thing, but if people got it, we wouldn't have the disease. So let's just talk about, again, how we do biosecurity. So first we try and keep the disease out, then we try and keep the disease in if we have it, and then we got to shut it down. So that is sort of the basics of biosecurity. as to how we try and implement it on a farm or industry or province or national basis. Now, how do we spread diseases? Pests can spread diseases, but all sorts of other things can spread diseases too. So diseased birds and birds incubating the disease, of course, is one of the issues. Other animals other than the livestock, right? So whether it's pets, wild birds, or the wildlife, vermin, insects, we have found avian influenza virus on flies and darkling beetles. Rats can be a vector for it. So let alone wild birds. And of course, Brian mentioned all these mammalian scavengers, and they can bring disease onto your farm if you're not managing your dead stock properly, for instance. Now, of course, clothing, shoes of visitors, employees moving farm to farm or between flocks. So we actually are one of the biggest causes of disease spread in the poultry industry, both on the commercial side and on the small flock side. Of course, contaminated feed, water, bedding, and soil can be an issue. Carcasses of dead birds, as I mentioned, with dead stock, contaminated farm equipment or vehicles, and of course, airborne particles like dust blowing out of your exhaust fans. So that has become one of the challenges as to how do you completely protect your birds. And we can never completely protect them. We can just help lower the risk, and that's what good biosecurity does. So of course, when we start looking at how disease spreads, and this slide has been kicking around for 20 plus years, but it is directly bird to bird, of course, within your flock. But then of course, this is just an infographic of how we can spread it with whether it's insects, wild birds, or mostly us. We've had cases of infectious laryngotracheitis or ILT being spread and within certain regions. And what was the common factor when we started tracing it back? The local coffee shop, where the farm managers would be doing their rounds and then just jumping in the truck to make it to the local coffee shop to meet with their buddies at 10 o'clock and not change their boots. And we actually were able to track an ILT outbreak based on the fact that this farm got it, this farm got it, this farm got it. What was the connection between the two? The local coffee shop. Now, one of the things that we push, and it's actually mandatory on the commercial side, and I try and push this on the small flock side too, is the concept of a visitor logbook or a sign-in sheet. What's the purpose of this? Is just so that you can know who's been on your site in case you've had the disease, and you can let them know, or you can trace, or going the other way, if they brought disease onto your farm, you can figure out, who's been on your farm the previous 2 weeks and try and determine if they brought it on. And yes, CFI will use this visitor logbook or sign-in sheet if you do have a disease problem, because they have to do their trace back and trace forward also. These forms can be found anywhere. I just Googled visitor logbook or visitor sign-in sheet, and this one here was from the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. It pulled up right on their website. You can just download and print it off. One of the bigger challenges I see with some of our small flock clients is the concept of quarantine and isolation. So, if you're bringing birds back into your flock, are you quarantining them properly? And are you bringing them back from any shows, races, any sort of events that is part of your business or your hobby? When you bring birds back, you potentially can bring diseases back with them. And in reality, like, we've had tons of regional or national shows be sort of the point source of a disease spread throughout the province. And, you try your best to do that. And we've had a lot of shows and fall fairs reach out to OMAFRA in the past to talk about biosecurity recommendations that they can do. But as a bird owner, you need to understand these activities pose a risk. How do you mitigate that risk? Do you go to the shows at all? Or if you do, how do you prevent disease coming back? So one of the ways to do that, and one of the most important things you can do is quarantine your birds when they come back, whether it's new purchased birds or birds returning from a show. You need to get good, clean birds coming in, but just because the seller says they're clean doesn't mean they actually are, because birds can be diseased with no clinical infections. So the concept of putting birds in a quarantine for up to 28 days is concept of at least going through 1 or 2 incubation cycles to see if those birds show disease. And with some diseases that can be subclinical, the stress of that move or that sale and bringing back to a new place can let that disease show itself again. So that is one of the reasons why you might have a healthy looking bird that you purchased, come back home, and then it starts shedding virus again. So you need to physically isolate or separate those birds from the main group of birds or flock. You don't want it in the same room. You do not want common ventilation, ideally a separate building or a room that can be completely segregated off. Diligent cleaning and disinfection. Make sure you've got separate clothing, boots, equipment. Feeding and handling of those birds is done at the end of the day, so that's the last birds you manage before you go back home. And of course, hand sanitation, change your boots, et cetera, et cetera. So this is sort of the basic quarantine 101. And it also gives you a chance to look for external or internal parasites. If these birds, if you're unsure if you need to vaccinate these birds, you can do that. As Ellen mentioned, with HPAI, there is no vaccination available, but so that is not an option. But if you have proper quarantine and you've got birds that are dying that we tend to see are high path, then the quarantine may help a little bit, but in the grand scheme of things, a lot of other diseases are out there besides HPAI. And then of course, sanitation of anything you transport those birds in, whether it's crates or pet carriers, on return needs to be cleaned and disinfected from those shows or auctions or events. So other than HPAI, there's all sorts of other things we deal with. Histomoniasis is something we see at the lab on a fairly frequent basis, and that's blackhead with turkeys. We don't really have a whole lot. We don't have a drug that can treat blackhead anymore, but really it's a turkey disease that chickens can carry, right? So having chickens and turkeys in the same pen, I've had small flock folks say, yeah, I've done that for years, and suddenly all my turkeys died. And that's blackhead. But that parasite can exist in the soil for years. So even a pen, like an outside flock that has had chickens at one point, you do not want to put turkeys on that same dirt. Inside, you can clean and disinfect the pen. This is a picture of ILT, but there's other things too. ILT is a herpes virus that can infect the trachea and give us that snick. And when it's really bad, you'll see the blood there, coughing up blood. But we've even got things like Marek's disease. And with the commercial chicken industry, our birds are vaccinated at the hatchery for Marek's, and it should impart lifetime protection. At some point, it does run out at some point, that vaccine protection. But if you're buying birds from a breeder, Marek's vaccination is going to be important. You can vaccinate adult birds also. When it comes to options for vaccination, talk to your vet. I know some vet clinics have done Marek's vaccine clinics. There's ways to do that safely so that we aren't bringing all these birds together and potentially spreading disease if they have it. There's ways to do that. Talk to your veterinarian about some of that, some of those vaccination options, either for Marek's or for ILT or for any other diseases. Brian started touching on some of the diseases that he's been seeing on the wild bird side, but we do see a Newcastle variants in our gulls and our cormorants and in wild pigeons, most often with neurological signs. If you're seeing any of these birds on your property, please, please, please call Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative to get them made aware. They can triage whether they need to pick those birds up and figure out how to get them to Guelph. But take-home message for our owners: you want to obtain a flock history of the birds that you're buying as accurate as possible, looking at vaccines that were given, disease issues they've had in the past. Don't go to buy-sell trades or auctions or other gatherings during high-risk periods, which is when, of course, spring and fall migration happen. Establish that quarantine facility, have a plan for feeding and handling birds in quarantine, resolve any disease problems before adding those new birds to your flock. And resolving that disease problem may include just not having those birds as part of your flock. And of course, clean and disinfect all equipment, crates, anything that's involved with birds. And cleaning and disinfection includes cleaning, which is with a soap, to get all the organic matter off. And then of course the disinfection with whatever product you want to use, whether it's Prevail, Virkon, there's lots of good disinfectants out there, or even bleach. This fall, you know, the message is don't walk disease into your barn, your yard, or your run. Report sickness to your veterinarian and self-quarantine until you know what's going on. And then of course the visitor logbook plays a role in that also, if we got to do trace back or trace forward. Wild bird exclusion, so keeping those birds away from your domestic birds. Pick up spilled feed. Why? Because that attracts wild birds and rodents. And rodents, especially rats, live outside the barn and then come in to feed. So they are going back and forth. They could be feeding on the carcass of a dead wild bird and then coming into your barn to feed on the poultry feed. So it's going to be important that you practice or you have good rodent control. And then, this is, I know this is going to be tough for some folks, but you know, fall migration starts end of August. And if we see if Brian starts seeing lots of birds, that means there's lots of HPAI out there. And if your birds are outside, there's higher risk, of course, for them picking up that disease also. And of course, clean, clean, clean. That's going to be a major thing about trying to keep your flock healthy, is to keep the yard and them clean. And of course, if you've got sick bird or high mortality concerns, as Ellen said, contact your local CFI office or your private vet to talk about that. And if you see dead wild birds, contact Canadian Wildlife Health Cooperative. Finally, when it comes to wild bird deterrence, I get asked this question all the time. I want to try and protect my birds, and how do I do that? Birds fall under two categories, migratory and non-migratory. So if they are migratory birds, you can get permits from Canadian Wildlife Services, which is part of the federal government, that's under Environment Climate Change Canada. If they're non-migratory native species, which includes wild turkeys, turkey vultures, you need to contact Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and they can walk you through that. There is no permits needed, but you need to try and do non-lethal ways to scare those nuisance birds away, and you need to show that there is harm. So anyways, that's part of what you need to look at, is depending on what type of bird it is. If you don't know, you can contact CWS or MNRF and they can direct you either way. One of the last things I want to end with is an odds ratio, and just another way to kind of talk about the same biosecurity message we've been talking about all along. And this slide comes courtesy of Featherboard Command Center and JP Vaillancourt from University of Montreal. But you have an odds ratio of 500 times lower if you disinfect. If you do something like disinfect your boots, change your boots, clean your hands, you're 500 times lower for picking up disease. You're 6 times lower if you change boots between barns. You're 6.5 times higher if you don't use an anteroom, which is instead of walking directly into the coop, you have a room where you can change out. You're 9 times higher if you don't manage movements properly. You're 7 times higher for picking up disease if your visitors have incomplete hygiene measures, which includes changing boots or washing hands or using gloves or any sort of PPE. And you're 29 times higher picking up disease if you share farm equipment with your neighbors, whether it's the shovel, the tractor, the manure spreader, whatever it might be, without proper cleaning and disinfection. When it comes to resources, of course, there's the CFI website has a ton of information on disease and even influenza. So does OMAFRA, and the Ontario Animal Health Network is one. But if you want to find more or less a one-stop shop for all of that, the Poultry Industry Council Biosecurity and Disease webpage has links to all of these websites on there in relation to various diseases, but mostly HPAI. That page has been up for quite a while, and there's lots of great information that's been posted on that page. And then finally, of course, Ashley mentioned Small Flock Ontario. So that site is up and live, and I would suggest you go check it out. And with that, be safe, stay vigilant, and take care. And we'll take questions, I guess, at the end, right?
Well, we're at the end. So you
We're at the end.
brought us home there. That was awesome. Thank you, Al. There's so much information in this space, and we're just trying to give that overview. So we just, if anyone has a question again, we can pop it into the chat, but we do have a couple questions that came in from people when they were registering. So Al, regarding coop cleaning, is cleaning and disinfecting the same process or the same thing as cleaning between flocks? Or should it all be the same thing?
It really shouldn't be. So like a proper C&D, and we've heard the thing that you don't want to make the place too clean. I've heard that on the commercial side. I've heard that on the small flock side. Yes and no, but if you have a disease scenario on your farm and your coop, a proper cleaning and disinfection is going to be needed, right? And that may include, if you got a dirt floor, you may actually have to take out a layer of dirt in there and bring in fresh gravel or whatever to do that. But one of the questions we get, and I know CFI's dealt with this, is how do you disinfect dirt? So sometimes it's actual removal, sometimes we use lime, sometimes it's piling it and composting it. So there's various options, and there's lots of resources that can help with that. But yeah, when it comes to cleaning and disinfection, go to your local dealer and talk about what cleaning and disinfection products they have, right? So, and once again, cleaning and disinfection, there's two steps. The cleaning needs a surfactant, a soap of some sort, and then the disinfection part requires something that will kill things, viruses, bacteria, fungus, and that'll all be on the label, right? And there's some really good general disinfectants out there, as I said, including bleach.
Okay, so what I'm hearing, like if you have a serious disease, then you're going to have to kind of do a scorched earth approach with the proper steps. And then if there's just that sort of different day-to-day kind of cleaning.
Yeah, and it's going to include like a fair bit of elbow grease, right? So a stiff brush, a scraper to get the organic matter off. But the day-to-day in between flocks, like including things like your waters, right? If waters can get scummy, so that's going to be one of the challenges you're going to have, is to make sure the water stays clean, because that can harbor all sorts of fun things too.
Right. Okay. Okay. Just another question too, considering it's been fairly hot this summer, how can you tell the difference between something like heat stress and something that is more concerning that you might need to talk to your vet about?
Who wants to take that? Shall I take that one?
Okay. Who's in charge here?
Well, okay. So with heat stress, like if, the main thing is going to make sure you have adequate water, right? Because birds will double their water intake when it's hot. You will see birds, if shade is another important thing you're going to need to have for those birds. If they're out in the sun, they're going to get sunstroke also, just like us. But birds don't sweat, right? So in order to get rid of heat, they need to drink cold water. They need to be able to, and because they don't sweat, like they do this clitoral panting, like they'll start panting, and that helps them get rid of heat. They'll flush the heat out by drinking twice as much water and flushing that out. So you might see their droppings get runny. That's okay, if they're just trying to push the heat out. If they start dying from the heat, which can happen once we get the humidex over 41, then yeah, it could be relatively easy to see that, be concerned that it's a disease scenario. But the question is, does the mortality keep on after that heat event? And with most heat events, like it'll get smoking hot during the day, the birds will hold on and then they'll die in the evening. So if they can continue to die the next day and the day after, then that would be a concern where you'd want to get going. We run into this issue in the commercial side, and I think CFI got a couple of calls to their sick bird line in the past because we've had heat events, and yes, it triggers some concern that then CFI's got to triage and figure out, is it a heat event or is it a disease?
Okay, thank you. So we did have a question from the chat. Are there any recommendations on handling biosecurity for those running poultry barns at fall fairs? Yes, there are. And we actually have a fact sheet on that on the OMAFRA website. So if you go to the ontario.ca /OMAFRA website, you can just put in exactly that, biosecurity recommendations for fall fairs, and that will come. Actually, I should try and maybe I'll just try and find what are some of the concerns, Al? Just lay that out for us.
It's more about, do you have a proper triage? So when birds are coming in, is someone checking to make sure that they're healthy, that they're not coughing, that they're not coughing, they have any disease issues? And if they do, are you sending those birds back home? During the show, if birds start showing symptoms of some disease, do you have a protocol to pull them out and maybe have a quarantine facility to put them away from the rest of the birds. If you're judging birds and you're handling birds, what is your protocol? Because nothing is better than spreading disease than handling a sick bird and then handling a bunch of healthy birds after the fact, right? So, you know, do you have some sort of sanitation? Are you wearing gloves? And even at the fall fairs or the shows, like I've seen cages that have got a double wall between the cages. Instead of one piece of wire between two birds, they put in a double wall with 2 or 3 inches so the birds can't actually get direct contact with each other. You know, there's many things you can do, but most of it is just making sure you have a protocol for making sure sick birds don't come in, and if they become sick, how do you deal with that to get them out? And then at the end of the day, like I said, do you have hand sanitation available at the fall fair for anyone who's handling the birds or even people that are close to birds? I know with a lot of them, you know, looking at the birds, feeding the birds is a big deal, and that can have its own challenges too. So anyways, we do have the biosecurity recommendations for the fall fairs, but if you've got any other questions, you can feel free to contact me.
All right, thank you. So Brian, as it relates to like bird feeders, was there any concern about having bird feeders on the property, or what about, like, how does that interact with what Al was saying about wild bird deterrence?
So yeah, I mean, if you have poultry on your property, then it's recommended to not have a bird feeder because that's going to attract many different species of wild birds, including, as Al mentioned, potentially other vermin like rats and mice that could also potentially move things around your property. So there's been a lot of talk about, just for the general public, bird feeders, good idea or not. We haven't seen many cases in songbirds to this point. So for AI, there's not a big concern for spread of AI between birds at bird feeders. There's other diseases that are a concern, but the main recommendation is that if you do have chickens, turkeys, other poultry on your property, then any sort of deterrent, i.e. non-attractant, is the way to go. So don't put up bird feeders because you don't want those birds coming onto your property and potentially bringing disease onto your property and bringing it to your chickens.
So this is a question about visitors to your property. I'm not sure who wants to handle this, but like, how do you kind of keep your flock safe if you've got visitors coming on and off? Like, let's say you're selling your house and you're going to have a bunch of random people coming because they're looking at the showings and things like that. Is there any setup that might help?
I guess the question is, are they going to be looking at the birds? Like, just keeping them away from where the birds are in the first place is going to be the best. But if you're selling a hobby farm, or the barn is part of that, then having some sort of segregation and or sanitation is going to be pretty critical, right? Whether it's a boot dip, whether it's plastic booties if they want to come in to visit. The logbook will be important. If they're going to handle birds, do you have a hand washing station both before and after, right? And people always think, okay, after I handle a bird, I gotta wash my hands. Well, you need to wash your hands before you handle the bird in case you're carrying anything also. And then if like finding out from your visitors if they have birds at home, right? Like that's gonna be another risk. So that might be more precautions might be needed if someone's coming onto your property that's got birds already. If you're in the process of selling birds or in the business of selling birds, and that's going to also require a bit more care on your part too. So making sure that whoever comes on site, if they're taking birds away, are they, where are you doing the transaction? Are you doing it in the barn? Are you doing it outside the barn? Is your conveyance, whether it's a chicken crate or whatever, are those cleaned before those come back, right? If you're lending chicken crates to someone to take birds home, do you clean and disinfect it before it comes back on your property? So yeah, once again, the biosecurity basics are there.
Okay.
Just to jump on that about visitors, we do stress that farms, both commercial and non-commercial, consider putting in their visitor logbook that they've had someone even just come to their house for a visit, because that still represents a potential point of infection coming onto the farm, which some people don't think of. You know, it's not necessarily that somebody's just, you know, delivering feed to your barn or something like that, and that represents the only type of you know, bringing the disease to your farm. It could still be somebody that's coming to visit you only at your residence and drives onto your farm with dirty tires, and they have, you know, a sick chicken back at their house or something like that. So just important to keep your visitor logbook as up to date as possible and consider all visitors.
That's a good point.
And actually pulling that string a bit further, that would include anyone who's coming on your property to hunt, right? Because they'll be running through anywhere from the swamp to whatever, and going from farm to farm. So, you know, segregation of those hunters can pose a risk to your farm, as well as crop scouts, as well as, you know, anyone else, right? So just be aware.
I just have one more question for Ellen. How do I stay informed? How do I know if there's a new active IP that's been an infected premise that's popped up?
Yeah, so I would say our website is the best place to get that information. Again, if there's a positive detection, that would be indicated on our website down to the township or county level. And then specifically as it relates to whether there's been a zone that's been drawn, that is posted on our website as well. And that's a dynamic process, right? So it does unfortunately mean that you'll need to regularly update yourself and take a look and see what the progress is with different zones and what have you as the outbreak progresses. But I would say the website is the most current and best place to get information.
It's good to know. Hey, I'm not seeing any other questions pop in. Pause for question. Nope. I think we're good. Good. Well, I just want to give another thanks to Al, Brian, and Ellen for sharing your experience and your insights. We'll see you folks again sometime in the fall. We're going to come up with what our next webinar is going to be about, seeing what happens throughout the fall. So thank you very much for joining us. And until the next time, stay safe.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Yeah.